Good morning. We are reviewing the conclusion of Hemshech Ayin Beis. We're on page 1408, Aleph Tav Ches. And essentially, the root source of souls and neshamas, even higher than Torah. And just to sum up what we learned, both Shnei Dvarim Kodmu La'olam, the Medrash says, Tan Ve'Elyo. Two things preceded existence, Torah and Yisrael. And then he concludes that among Torah and Yisrael, Yisrael is even higher than Torah. And yet, as we learned earlier, there are places where Yisrael depends on Torah, where Torah is higher than Eden. Yisrael Araisa v'kutche brichu kulachad. Yisrael through Araisa, through Torah, gets connected to God. So we learned that's how the neshamas are below, and they need the light, the illuminating light, the guiding light of Torah, like an eye. A physical eye needs outside light, siyua, to be able to see. But then, once a neshama does see, it has the capacity to reach and connect to its ultimate source, which is rooted even higher than Torah. And there are different expressions he used to explain those words. Torah is shashuyim, tainug, shashuyim atzmim, but it's still a tainug in Torah and chachma, or if not even chachma, but in something. And neshamas is the tainug atzmi mamish. And now we also use the word shmoy hakol batzmusei, as we learned, which he said is the level of helema atzmi, as we learned earlier as well on page 1271, 1270, as I referred to yesterday. So that is even higher than Torah. Now, before I elaborate a bit more on that, let me just go back to the summary. So Torah, therefore, is the level what he calls Chachma Reishis, Lashon Nekeva, so it's Mekabel, like Yechid Mekabel from Yachid. Even though Be'etzem Torah is a Mashpia, even when it's a Mekabel, it's still a Mashpia Torah and everything has to come through the Gili of Torah. Even what Neshama Yisrael Mamshichim HaGili is also through Torah, as I explained yesterday, so it's fundamentally a Mashpia, but it has an element of Mekabel when it's receiving from Neshamas, which are rooted even higher. So Yisrael, on the other hand, is called Reish, Lashon Zachar, and Reish is Reish is Lashon Zachar, Lashon Mashpia. That's on Neshamas, on Mashpia into Reishis of Torah. Reish is also the letters Asher, which is Tainug, like Osher, Osher. Tainug Atzmi Mamish, that's higher than the Shashrim Atzmim of Torah, than the core delights of Torah. And that's what the Neshamas are mamshech into Torah, that Tainug Atzmi of Atzmus Ein Sof. The same thing with mitzvahs. When we say mitzvahs, Asher Kedeshanu b'mitzvahs v'tzivanu, so there's what mitzvahs are mashpia into Neshamas. That's obvious. Mitzvahs connect us to God, like he says afterwards. We'll get to that in a second. And then there's how in Asher, from the same word Asher, from the word Tainug, Asher Kedeshanu, the Tainug that Yidna Mamshech into mitzvahs. So now we see this in the two psukim, these two aspects.
You have also in Torah, Asher Bochar Bonu.
Okay. It doesn't mention that, but yes, that's correct. Yeah. So we see the two psukim, these two aspects, where mitzvahs are mashpia into neshamas and neshamas are mashpia into mitzvahs, is we find Laman tiskuru v'asisim es kol mitzvah Yisrael Laman tiskuru shehem bechinas tchar lashon zochar lashpia b'mitzvahs, and the previous pasuk says that the v'schatim is called mitzvahs havaya, the hainush ashpa b'neshamas Yisrael, that mitzvahs havaya mechaber havaya im neshamas Yisrael, which is already. That's an Oyer Ein Sof, that is, well, Oyer rather, that comes in Shtalshus Medidav Agbala, in a measure. That's Elikuz that's defined on our terms. Then comes the Mantiskaru, Mitzvesai, that's the Neshamas Yisrael, that are Mashpia, Zocher Mashpia, Mamshichim Bechinis Mitzvesai. The mitzvahs that come, my mitzvahs, which are the mitzvahs from Atzmus Ein Sof, Hischabrus Atzmus Ein Sof Ima Elams. So there you have both aspects of mitzvahs. And then comes the parentheses that we learned, which is that Earlier we said Atik is Yeridus Ha'atzmus. Atzmus relating, well, I shouldn't say relating. Atzmus moving one step in order to be able to ultimately be connected with existence, and Neshamas are mamshech from that level of Atik. But then he says, Yesh Leimer, that the Sheresh Hamshach is even higher than Yeridus Ha'atzmus. Because Atzmus saying stuff like we learned the third level, the level of Yachid, which is even higher than Yeridus Ha'atzmus, higher than Atik. That's the level of Shmoya Kol Ba'atzmusei Helema Atzmi. I want to add one thing about the Helema Atzmi. I asked yesterday, or I was explaining earlier, the previous page, he doesn't mention Helema Atzmi. He mentioned Eir HaKol Ba'atzmusei, and there he bundled that together with shame. If you go to the exact language, he said these words, that Eir is Achrei Neshe Be'ein Sof, and he says, Koyach in Yechelis, which is Eir V'Shem HaKol Ba'atzmusei, is Keir v'Yechelis, and that which is Kadman Kikadmusei, which means it has the aspect of God's so-called preceding everything. And he said that's also Achrei Neshe B'Maitzil, that level, because that's not the place that Ikar Elikus. And there he put together Shmoy and Oir. He said Oir v'Shem in one, literally in one phrase. Later he said the Sheresh Hamshach is Shmoya Atzmi. He doesn't mention Oir. Now he added Helema Atzmi. So I was thinking that perhaps you can explain it this way. And with another question. If you say Neshama se Helema Atzmi, how is that consistent with saying Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam? Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam means the flame of God, and a flame is Oir. Maybe not the level of Oir, like Torah Oir, but it's still a flame. So on one hand, Neshama is Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam. It's an illuminating thing. It's a flame. And we see neshamas do illuminate. It's true, down when neshama comes down below, it doesn't have all that power, and therefore it needs Torah to so-called like the outside light, siyua, to allow the eye to see. But ultimately, a neshama also has an illuminating power. And then we say it's a helema atzmi. So you have to say that neshama has both elements to it. It has an element of oir in it, and it has an element of helem in it. This is what makes neshama so formidable. Torah does not connect to Helem. Torah is a gilui. Torah is a gilui of God. He's giving us His Torah. Nasalanu as Torah, His wisdom, His rotzen, His will, His blueprint, His delights. These are all ultimately a revelatory force. It's a very high level of Shashuyim Atzmim. Neshama has both aspects. Neshama is rooted in the Etzem, as we know, like a child rooted in the parent, the very DNA. But the Etzem has two things. The Eibishter has both a Eir HaKol Ba'atzmusei, and he has a Helema Atzmi. And the Neshamas carry both elements in them. So the fact that they carry both, that already makes them, in a way, higher than Torah. But they also carry Helema Atzmi, and that's why the Neshama ultimately comes down into a structure. Like I said, Elikus Shanasa Yesh. Very interesting Maimer, Noyach Maimer, in Tafresh Ayin Ches, from the Rebbe Rashab, Aseh Lecha Tevas, which talks about building the Teva, where he talks about this at length, how Elikus Nasi Yesh, that even though the Neshama does become something of substance, it enters inside of a body. Torah doesn't enter into any body. Yes, it enters into a Sefer Torah on parchment, and there are words on paper, so on parchment, but the bottom line is Torah remains something above and beyond existence, even though it manifests within existence. A neshama manifests completely inside of a body, to the point that it can be golus on neshama, as he explains in Tanya, and we learned earlier in Ayin Beis, that the neshama gets concealed, completely concealed, as if it's in captivity inside the body and the animal soul, and has to contend with that. The Torah never is trapped in that way. As a matter of fact, divrei Torah eina makablim tuma. The words of Torah don't in any way retain any impurities. A neshama goes into a body. Yes, the etzem of neshama remains intact, but the neshama does have to deal with existence. We learned this at length in the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, how neshama comes down below in the Guv Nefesh Habamis, and there it gets concealed. And we learned it also here earlier. So as such, the neshama therefore has the ability to deal with concealment, which is what makes the neshama the ability to go into a world of Helem, because it's rooted in the Helem Atzmi, and bring Gili there with the power, of course, and help of Torah and mitzvahs, And again, the neshama also has the element of a ner. So all that together creates a neshama that has both an element of eir in it and an element of helam in it. So it's ultimately rooted in helam ha'atzmi, which is higher than eir, hakol batzmusei. So perhaps that's why the way he structured it this way. First, he's focusing that how neshama is higher than Torah, even the level of eir hakol batzmusei. And then he goes even further and says the neshama is actually rooted in the etzem itself, even before Yeridas ha'atzmus. Now the question whether Yeridas ha'atzmus atik is a form of eir or eir hakol or not, that's something that needs to be discussed. It's not clear entirely. But we'll learn more about this, as I said, on page 1415. Going to talk a little more about this topic. So just wanted to add that into the whole equation here.
This is fascinating, but the Oyer HaKol B'Atzmuse is not Oyer Ein Sof, right? This is because you're comparing with Helam Ha'atzmi.
Eir Ein Sof is a very general term. Eir Ein Sof includes Eir HaKol B'Atzmuse. Then there's Eir that's not Kol B'Atzmuse, that's Kedem Alei Saratzen, like he calls it Eir Legala La'atzmei. And then there's Eir Legala, the Eir HaShayach Le'elemis. So Eir Ein Sof is all the above. But Eir HaKol B'Atzmuse is higher than the substance of Eir. It's basically God's capacity to, like Yecholte Lahoyer, Yecholte Shaloi Lahoyer. That would be like the Eir HaKol B'Atzmuse, the Yechelis Lahoyer, and the Helam Ha'atzmi would be Yecholte Shaloi Lahoyer.
And also, if we take the
even though he doesn't use that expression here, but that would be the idea. He did use it earlier, where he spoke about. Just one second here. What did he say? By Yecholte Shaloi Lahoyer. Oh, by the Levana. He actually said that by the Shemesh and Levana, that both of them are Ma'iris. They're both a Ma'ir, but one is a Ma'ir that is a Koyach HaGili, and one is a Koyach HaNelam, the Koyach to conceal. But that's on lower levels. That's not. That's on lower levels. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that if we both come, it says "Kemoshi kasafta aleinu b'torasecha," so we also are imprinted with the Torah. But if we look at the physical body of a human and the physical body of a Torah, the physical body of a human animates itself, could actually is higher because it could move.
Yeah, on the other hand, the Torah is higher. We stand up for the Torah. The Torah doesn't stand up for us. Because the Torah
can't. It's inanimate.
The Torah is a Gili Alakus that is, in its Kedusha and its Gili, it's higher than a Neshama, like we learned earlier. Because it manifests, the Torah is what Hashem gave us, His very Torah, in words in the Sefer Torah or in the Luchas and so on. So it all depends. We learned that Torah has an element that's higher than the Shamas.
Depends on the level.
Have an element that are higher than Torah. He made that very clear in this Hemshech here. Yeah. Okay. Are there any other questions, or else I'm ready to continue? Where did he speak about? A second. I just wanted to see one thing here. 1 second. Yeah, on page 1404, he spoke relatively at length how when the neshama comes down below, just looking for the exact language. Yeah, haguva nefesh habamis ma'limim umastirim al ha'oras era neshama from Yenosi. Yeah. Okay. And that's where he spoke about the power of the Torah to break the halamas v'asterim and to illuminate a neshama down below. That was a very important point on that side of things. Okay. So now we're on page 1408. We finished the parentheses, 7 lines from the top, and I'll continue reading inside. And the pages, if you want to follow the text, can be seen at ayinbeis.com. V'zeu shekosov, says the Rebbe Rashab. He continues now. This that we just said, that neshamas are mashpia into Torah, from all the way from the etzem, the mashpia, the tainug atzmi mamish. And now he said even higher than you read the sa'atzmus of Atik, which also helps explain, because he said before that Pnimis HaTorah reaches those levels. So this is even higher. He says, V'zeu shekosav, this is what it says, Vayisem kadeshim lelekechem. That you will be kadeshim, you will be holy to God. So the simple meaning of it is that you will be holy, that, like it says, that God wants you to sanctify yourself. But he's going to now teach. Shetigramu da'atzmus en sof yeh b'chinas kodesh. V'yisem kadeshim lelekechem, he's teaching like the second teaching, Kedeshim Tiyu, which I'll explain in a moment. Not just that you will be holy lelekechem before your God, but you will actually be mamshech kedusha lelekechem. Kedeshim lelekechem. Shetigramu. You will cause that Atzmus Ein Sof will be in a level of Kodesh. That's a level of not makabel of mashpia. Li is that Atzmus Ein Be'erech, Gam Li is B'chinas Kodesh, being that Atzmus on his own, Atzmus, is completely beyond and removed from being even the level of Kodesh. Oy Kodesh. There's Kodesh with a Vav, there's Kodesh or Kadesh without a Vav, which is Kadesh Mili Begarmei, which is even a higher level. That there's when you say when you say something is holy, as Rashi teaches, Kedoshim, it means removed, Havdalah. It's moved. Shabbos Kodesh. It's holy compared to the mundane weekdays. Ben Kodesh L'Chayil. So even though it's removed, but it still shows on a relationship. When you talk about Atzmus Mamish, Atzmus has no relationship altogether. You can't even call it Kodesh or Kadesh, or even higher Kadesh. But a neshama, through doing Torah mitzvahs and his mamshech halakus, is mashpia that causes that Atzmus should be in a state of Kodesh. In other words, it's like drawing down Atzmus to come at least in a state of being removed from us, holy, expressing that holiness in existence. They're mamshech that there should be that level of Kodesh. Sends us to the Maimah. There's a Maimah that Rebbe Rashab said at the wedding of the Frierdiker Rebbe. It's called Samach to Samach Tofresh Nun Zayin, a very famous Maimah. We discusses this more at length. Let me explain. You probably heard this Pirush. So we have the Pasuk in Pasha Kedeshim begins, Kedeshim Tiyu L'Hashem Elokecha. You should be holy, Ki Kodesh Ani. Because I am holy. So it's a mitzvah. Just as God is holy, so too you should be holy. Sanctify yourself. And how do we sanctify ourselves? Through mitzvahs, through our behavior. As the different commentaries explain what that means. That's a simple interpretation. The Medrash says, on that pasuk, what does he say? Ki kodesh ani. So he says like this: Kadeshim tiyu l'Hashem Elokecha. You should be holy before God. So you yochel kemeni. You would think you could be as holy as God is. So the pasuk says, Ki kodesh ani. No, kedushasi l'mayla mikdushaschem. My holiness, God is saying, Ki kodesh ani, is my holiness is higher than your holiness. That's the Medrash, the simple interpretation of the Medrash. Comes the Baal Shem Tov. Chassidus cites this, Eirateira and Samach Tzedek. The Rebbe brings it a number of places. Fascinating interpretation. Reads the Medrash the other way around. Not as a question, but as a statement. So it says like this. Kadeshim tiyu Hashem Elokecha. That you should be Kaddish. So Yochel Kameni. Not as a question, does that mean as much as me? Yeah, Yochel Kameni, you can be as holy as I am. Why? Ki kedushasi l'mayla. My kedusha l'mayla mikdushaschem comes from your kedusha. So instead of interpreting it that my kedusha is higher than your kedusha, my kedushasi lamaila. So the first, the simple interpretation is kedushasi is lamaila mikdushaschem. The Baal Shem Tov's interpretation is kedushasi lamaila. My kedusha lamaila comes from your kedusha below. When you're mekadesh Shem Shamayim, when you sanctify God's name through your behavior and through your actions and through living your life as God wants you to live it, you sanctify God. You're drawing down Atzmus into Kodesh. Without that, the Eibishter could be concealed or removed, and you don't know that. When a Jew walks in the street and makes a Kiddush Hashem, they're actually Mamshich. Kedoshi Lamaila is coming Mikdushaschem. So it's not just drawing down Hashem's Kedusha, it actually, my Kedusha Lamaila, because I'm removed from Kodesh, like he just said. Atzmus is removed from all of this. But Neshamas Yisrael, through their Avodah, they draw down that Kedusha downward. So there you see what he's saying before about Hashpah, that who's the Mashpia here? The Neshamas Yisrael are Mashpia even in Elikus. The Mashpia that Elikus should be drawn down to be down below into a state of Kodesh. So when you said before the pasuk, he said, what did he say? The expression was Laman Tiskuru Mitzvesai. So that was the same idea that Laman Tiskuru, that Neshamas Yisrael should be mishpia from Atzmus Ein Sof, that should come down below. So now he explained. That's how he explains this thing where Yisim the pasuk that Yisim Gedeshim Lelekechem. Okay, that's additional point that he makes. Now, unless somebody, any questions? Anybody wants to ask anything?
I think that you just said it a second ago, but I just want to clarify that. I mean, I posted the pasuk from Bamidbar. It's obviously it's famous pasuk, and I probably didn't even need to post it. But Laman Tiskru of Sisam Komis Vasai, the notion of Dchar, that the male is mashpia, that's the remez from Yisrael Asher, and so Mantiskru, that you should essentially be mashpia, should seed my mitzvahs, and because the neshamas are higher than Torah, and you will essentially connect the lower world to Hashem's holiness because the neshamas have such a high madrega. Is that what you were saying?
Not sure what you're. I'm not sure what you're saying right now.
I'm saying
he said very clearly. His first Laman Tiskuru was where he spoke of the two psukim. One is what mitzvahs are mashpia into neshamas.
Yeah, exactly.
And then there's what neshamas are mashpia into mitzvahs, mitzvahsai from Atzmus Ein Sof.
Right.
And then came the parentheses. And he said, V'zeu, this idea is vayisa gedeshim lelekechem, that they cause, speak an additional point now, that Atzmus Ein Sof, which is removed even from the level of Kodesh, should come into the state of Kodesh, and in other words, it should come to a level where you're Mamshech Kodesh, that we can experience it, as opposed to being completely removed.
Yeah, well, I was trying to say that.
Two different psukim and two different points, but the similar idea that neshamas are mashpia, that's the key, the common denominator here. He's not coming to explain the pasuk Laman Tiskuru. He's speaking a similar idea in Vayisim Gedeshim Lelekechem.
Well, that's why I was asking a side corollary question on the grammar Laman Tiskuru. I mean, I understand that the shot is that in order that you should remember and do all of my mitzvahs.
So you're going back to, we're not talking about Vayisim Gedeshim now, right now.
No, Laman Tiskuru.
So you heard his interpretation. Tiskuru, he said Zocher from I asked the question now, how is it different than V'schartem? But what? Not sure what you're asking.
No, it helps clarify. It helps like to employ the idea of Laman Tiskuru onto this. It's helpful.
That's what I'm saying.
That was. He said earlier that Laman Tiskuru is from the word Zocher yet Char Mashpia.
So it's nice to see an example of it. It's nice to see him.
Where did you say that?
I'm not sure what we're discussing, to be honest.
Laman Tiskuru, where did he talk about? Was it from that pasuk itself? I don't remember.
Laman Tiskuru is a pasuk in Parsha Shlach.
No, it's the same part. No, No, the Montister is the same parsha.
What are we discussing right now? One second. I'm confused here. I just learned inside a new piece on the pasuk Vayisam Gedeshim Lelekechem. Are we discussing that, or are we going back to what we learned yesterday? I'm not sure what we're discussing here.
Both. We're discussing both. I'm looking at
two separate things. The Rebbe Rashab said Lamantiskru, done. We covered that. Now he added, he said, V'zeu shekasav Vayisam Gedeshim Lelekechem. That's not, Lamantiskru is the hamshach into mitzvahs. They should have mitzvah sai connected to Atzmus Ein Sof. And to be mamshach that it said, like he said, the schaber yirisa atzmus is schaber ima. I'm sorry, schaber atzmus ima elamis. Now he's adding the idea that we're actually manifesting atzmus, which is completely removed, should be the level of kodesh, which is still removed, but it relates, and that's what neshamas hamashpia.
But right,
I just explained it with Kadeshim to you, the Torah of the Baal Shem Tov. So I'm not sure. Is there a question now? Is there a
Yes. Well, first of all, you asked me a question. You said I don't understand your question, and I'm trying to explain it. I'm talking about the grammatical construction of the pasuk from Bamidbar.
We already discussed that yesterday. What's this? Go ahead.
Because it connects the two concepts. One pasuk.
Well, what does Tiskuru have to do with Kadeshim?
Because it's the idea of neshamas being mashpia.
Yeah, but he doesn't mention the word Tiskuru in the pasuk Kadeshim. Just keep that in mind.
Can you look at what I posted? That's what I'm trying to say. There's a grammatical construction.
Let's take it off. We'll talk about it afterwards because it's not. I'm not sure how it's helping here right now.
Well, it's right on point. Okay. I think
as I could understand. This also gave us a chance to set the level of holiness in the whole world, as it was like you make this first step, how everything in this world would set up on the higher level of holiness, or it depends on you, on your behavior.
Yeah, we understand that. That's understandable. Let me just say this. Look, yes, correct. I just saw what you posted. Vayisam Gedeshim is the end of the pasuk of Laman Tiskru. That's what you're saying? Yeah, that's why he brings it here. Correct. So Laman Tiskru, he spoke about that, the hashpah of the Zohar, so to speak, mitzvah into mitzvahs. And then he concludes and interprets Vayisag Deshim Lelekechem, that this idea of being mashpia into Adar Atzmus should be nimshach into the level of Kaddish. So it's one flow. That's what you want to say, that it's one flow? Yeah, that's of course, that's obvious. I thought that was a given. It's one pasuk.
למען תזכרו ועשיתם את כל מצוותיי והייתם קדושים ללקחם.
Right, that's what I posted.
Okay, good.
I said when I started my question, I think you just said it, but I want to clarify. Anyway, go ahead.
Look, to me that was a given. It's a continuation of the verse, and he's continuing to explain the whole verse. Yeah.
Okay.
He also explained the previous verse. The previous verse was v'zachartem. That's called mitzvah savayim. So we actually have an explanation of two verses here in Parsha Shlach.
Yeah.
He's also saying here, there's Atzmus Einoi Be'erech, Viris Bechinas Kodesh or Kodesh, even higher than Kodesh.
That's what we just said, yeah.
Kodesh is higher than Kodesh.
Kaddish is higher than Kodesh.
Kodesh is higher than Kodesh, yeah.
Yeah.
But Kodesh is above with Amshach already. Kodesh is...
Yeah, Kodesh is Mila Begameh, as I mentioned. It's a word on its own, doesn't need Amshach even, right?
But through the mitzvahs, you are making it to be Kodesh.
Well, I don't know about the mitzvahs, but definitely in the Neshamas Yisrael doing it. Okay. Okay?
I meant Neshamas.
Okay, good. Ready to move on?
100%.
I didn't get the difference. I'm sorry. What you were just saying about Kaddish and Kodesh? That part I didn't get. I'm sorry.
So just listen again, because I explained it before.
Okay.
I'm just going over. It's essentially two levels in holiness. One is somewhat of already an extension. That's Kodesh with a Vav, and there's Kodesh without a Vav, which is a word of its own. It just means it's holy. Not holy in relation to something, but just holy. Both these levels are, Atzmus is removed from both of them. And the Neshamas Yisrael draw them down. Like I explained before, to make a Kiddush Hashem in this world, you need to have a human being, a Neshama down in this world that sanctifies God's name. That's called drawing down, that a Lakush should be in a state of God. But here it goes deeper. It's not just drawing it for others. Even Atzmus itself would be removed without this Neshamas Yisrael not being Mamshich, Liz B'chinas Kodesh. It's like we say in Rosh Hashanah that when we crown and coronate God as king, so God is God, but we are essentially causing and stimulating, or you want to say, arousing God's desire to want to be king and want to relate to us.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you.
Okay. Now he's taking us back. This is going to conclude what he began to discuss. If you remember on 1403, after explaining at length, relatively, how Torah is mashpia into neshamas, because they are concealed in this world and we need Torah to illuminate, then he said, Omna Metzinu, if you go back to 1403, we find that the sages have the power to do something beyond Torah. And he gave a bunch of examples that they could sanctify the moon and even make a mistake and even a deliberate, and you follow their guidelines. And that on Yamin Shmuel, that they have the capacity of the Hira Shah temporarily to suspend Torah law in order to protect Torah law. So how is that possible? How can a neshama, how could a human being override Torah, so to speak? That's where he began the whole discussion on page 1403. And then he concluded, he said that you have to say, Tzrichim leimer shezeh mepnei sheYisrael be'emes kodma l'Torah. You have to say, because in truth, Yisrael precedes Torah. I'm reading on the page 1403. And that's because Yisrael, that's why they can permit something that the Torah prohibits temporarily. And then he began to explain the two levels of Torah and Neshamas Yisrael, that sometimes you find one is higher than the other, which we've been learning now for the last 4 or 5 pages. So now he goes back to that. It says, Valpi Hanal. According to everything we just learned in the last 5 pages, Yuvan Mashayesh B'Koyach Bezdin will understand why the power of Bezdin, a court of law, Torah law, Lasses L'Tzedach Shah Shalei Al Pi HaTorah, could do something temporarily, L'Tzedach Shah, for the immediate moment, for the emergency, for the immediate need. They can do something that is not according to what it says in Torah, like we learned on page 1403. Why? Sheyesh mitzad shorshe haneshama shein l'mayla ma'atera. Because they have within them sheyesh b'keich bez nasas tzech shosh lapeteh. Sheyesh mitzad. That's possible because the neshamas have within them something that's higher than Torah. It's not, God forbid, that there's a competition between the two. They have something that's rooted even higher. So neshamas Yisrael, as they come down below in the form of a scholar, a sage, a Torah sage, can say, here's the situation that we need to suspend momentarily what the Torah says, like he said, to desecrate a Shabbos in order to preserve many Shabboses. Only a neshama can do that. The Torah is I don't want to use the word static, because it's not a good word to use on Torah, but the Torah is a book of laws. This is the system. The neshamas come from a place that are higher than the system, so it could actually say, here's what we need to do temporarily. It's like Havdil, you'll find an expert doctor may say, the situation demands, an emergency situation, procedure demands that we do something that's not conventional. In other words, even though regular medicine would dictate do ABC, but this situation requires, for whatever reason, requires something that we have to go deeper, and you can only rely on someone that's a true expert to say that. Because anyone else would say we have to follow we have to follow protocol. You have to follow the best procedures, best practices. So that's what neshamas is, because they have the power that goes all the way to the etzem. Because a neshama is basically coming from a higher place in godliness. And remember, at the end of the day, the Torah is God's Torah. The Torah is not a power of its own. So a neshama who's like it's like almost like saying, yes, my father instructed us to do so and so, but being that he's my father, the neshama says, I know that in this situation, my father would want me, at least temporarily, to suspend what he usually recommended in order. Like, for example, the concept of, like he said, Lishmer Shabbos is harbe. You make a decision. Who makes a decision that there's a danger to someone on Shabbos? And as such, you need to be Mechal Shabbos. You need to desecrate Shabbos. You need to drive on Shabbos. Or on Yom Kippur to do something that is usually prohibited to save a life. Who determines that? That's a combination. You actually listen to a doctor. And a doctor will tell the rabbi and say, this is a situation where to save a life, that's what you have to do. So it's not coming to, God forbid, as the Eira Chaim and other commentaries explain, that Pekuach Nefesh doesn't desecrate Shabbos. It actually sanctifies Shabbos. Because as I mentioned yesterday, V'chai Behem, the whole Torah was given to live by. And now is a situation that in order to preserve life, the only way to do so is by not keeping the laws, the technical laws of Shabbos. And without, you're preserving Shabbos because you're preserving what Hashem wants from Shabbos. But who can decide that? Only a level that's higher than the book itself, so to speak. That's the neshamas that are kodmu l'Torah and higher than Torah. That's the point that he's making here.
It's
Of
interesting
course,
that this is only neshamas begufim.
This has to be qualified properly, because if this can also be abused and misused, because then anybody can come and say, hey, you know what? I think this situation warrants transgressing Torah, God forbid. That's not so simple. There are the Torah itself gives us rules of when and how and so on, and it has to be done by the right person. Not anyone can come and say, you know what, I've determined this situation warrants the breaking of Torah, God forbid. That's not a license for that. This is explaining why in certain situations, given the right conditions, where Chachamim have this ability to so-called override, or I would say more than override, actually understand the deeper meaning of what Torah really wants. Like that, only a real master can do that. Someone that has the bittul, that's not doing it for any self-interest, which of course goes without saying, that this can't be driven by someone's interest. This is driven because it's driven by God and what God wants of us. So ultimately, in a sense, it's actually, the Torah itself would agree that this situation requires that you don't follow this particular law temporarily, as we learned, and all the other details that we learned about the power of Chachamim to so-called go beyond Torah, beyond the regular structure of Torah, is the way I would put it. It's not exactly the same level, but it's similar when Moshe Rabbeinu was able to gain forgiveness, Salachti Kidvarecha and Yom Kippur. The law would dictate that if someone builds an idol, the golden calf, it's a death penalty, Yarg Val Yaver. And yet Moshe was able to reach deeper within the etzem, like Chassidus says, that Tshuva reaches in the Baal HaRotzen, not just the Rotzen. The Rotzen of Hashem is to follow the laws, but the Baal HaRotzen is the one that owns the one that created the will in the first place. So you're going back straight to the source, and in certain situations, you have the capacity to open up the door of Tshuva and go even beyond what would have been regular structure and the regular, which is why Hashem resisted for 80 days, because there is a structure, there's cause and effect. It's like you put your hand in fire, it gets burned. What do you want me to do? Hashem said, there's cause and effect. And Moshe's response, I'm paraphrasing, would have been, well, you're the one that created those rules, so you can suspend them at least temporarily in order to help and save the people, etc. So now he doesn't bring tshuva here very intentionally, and that's why I was careful. I didn't want to really, I'm just bringing it as an example, because tshuva really belongs in the mamata lamaila discussion when you're going from distress and you're reaching the highest levels of the helam ha'atzmi. Here, we're not talking from distress, we're talking about in Torah itself, where a bezdin determines due to a situation. It could be an emergency situation or other situations that they determine that requires a temporary shift or a temporary suspension in order to preserve Torah, etc. So that is what we just learned. And he's now going to continue. Somebody you wanted to ask something?
It's interesting that this is only neshamas begufim could do. Torah lo b'shamayim hi.
Correct.
So there is something, maybe because this level of people, when they are in the gufim, they broke down the oil and shamat b'mkoiro, even here lamato. I don't know.
Well, the answer is very straightforward, because the whole purpose of why neshamas have this power is to come down into this world and transform it. It's not just that God gave neshamas power in Atzilus or in Bria or in Yetzirah. The whole power of neshama is to come down into a body, into an animal soul, to use the Torah to make a dira b'tachtenim, which is nesava kodesh baruch hu in atzmus. So the whole purpose of it all is to come down below. It's not that neshamas and Torah are very powerful forces, but there's a goal. There's the goal, like we spoke the other day when I explained the whole structure, that the goal is to go into the building that God created, which is the world, and transform it. So here's where that power comes alive. So it's actually the helama atzmi of the neshama's root is really expressed most in this world where there's a helam. And then, of course, together with the power of Torah and Torah and Neir Hashem Nishmas Adam, we can illuminate the darkness of this world and turn it into a divine home. That's Torah Lebashamayim, right? And that's what says, U'kamosha Kosev, Rak ba'vesecha cheshek Hashem.
Choshak.
It was only... Choshak, huh?
Choshak.
Choshak Hashem. It is dafke b'veisecha in your forefathers that God had choshak, desired. In other words, it's essentially a pasuk that's proving that neshamis is the ultimate thing that God desires. Choshak Hashem. Shezeu hatainug. Choshak is from the word cheshek, like choshak, to desire. This is the tainug b'neshamis Yisrael mitzad atzmam. Dafke. The tainug that is in the neshamis Yisrael on their own, even higher than the tainug of Torah. Shenizbar le'il, that was discussed earlier. Shezeu b'chinas hatainug da'atzmus ein sof mamish shalamayla gam b'chinas shashuyim ha'atzmim de Torah. This is the tainug of atzmus ein sof mamish, above, that's higher than even the shashuyim atzmim, the core essential delights of Torah. The tainug, like I said, the example of a parent and a child, just the pure pleasure of your child without any performance, without any education, without any Torah, just a pure essential connection of the etz of atzmus. Tainug b'neshamis Yisrael. Rak b'vesecha choshek Hashem. Valkein. And because that exists, because the neshama has that, b'shum eis lasis l'Hashem. And that's why we say, eis lasis l'Hashem hefeiru teidasecha. That there's a time for the purpose of Hashem, hefeiru, to abrogate Torah. This is what's used in explaining how Rabbeinu HaKadosh wrote down Torah Shabbat Peh, and that's a clear prohibition. You're not supposed to write down oral Torah. Dvarim Shabbat Peh, ein yevshir, ein rishai, lichtev. You're not supposed to write down oral Torah. But since they saw it was being forgotten, the Torah, so they said, Eisas lasis l'Hashem. It's a time, in other words, on behalf of God, we're doing this. Hefeiru teidasecha, we're going to abrogate a law on the Torah in order to preserve the Torah. V'hainu, and Rebbe Rashab explains, sheyushlam b'chinas ha'chefetz v'akavona atzmis. That's Eisas lasis Hashem. In order to complete the desire and the intention and the purpose, the core purpose of atzmus ein sof mamish, shaloi bo b'chinas chachmas de Torah, that they're not manifest in the wisdom of Torah. Because in the wisdom of Torah, you have the blueprint, that's the structure, that's the law and order, and the laws of what is right and what is wrong, the Torah telling us, dictating to us, the Tayyag mitzvahs that God wants us to follow in order to align and transform this world into a dira b'tachtenim. But here we have a unique situation. So Neshamas Yisrael are able to access a place that's even higher than Shashrim Atzmim of Torah, because what they're doing is they're going higher than the Chochmah of Torah into the Chefetz, Eis Las Hashem Chefetz v'Akavona Atzmis, the Atzmus Ein Sof. So b'yecholtem, with that power, they have the capacity, Las is Gam Shaloi Al Pi HaTorah, They have the ability to do something that is not according to what is written in the Torah, al kopanim, written in the obvious way. As I said, Torah itself sanctions this, because the Torah knows that there's these possibilities. Is a pasuk in the Torah. So it's interesting, the Torah itself, like he said before, all Giluyim come from Torah, even the Gilui that tells you that now you have to temporarily abrogate or temporarily suspend a mitzvah, that also Torah tells us. But who activates that? Who determines that? That's Neshamas Yisrael, because they have this capacity of where they're rooted to go to that source. And again, I say it with important qualification. This is not a license for anyone to come ahead and just invoke this rule. This requires serious decision making, a serious thought and discussion before anything like this is even entertained. And even then, it's coming temporarily and it's coming from this level of Neshamas Yisrael. But the capacity to do so is due to the Neshamas root all the way in the Tainaga Atzmi Mamish, that's even higher than the Shashriyim Atzmim of Torah. Actually, I see he does bring tshuva as an example in the parentheses. So I said before he didn't bring it. I see he does bring it, but we'll get to that in a moment. Okay, it's a pretty heavy piece here. Any questions?
Well, in terms of applying it, I mean, what if you're in a situation where you can't ask a beis din? I mean, you just do it and you violate Shabbos because you think you're saving somebody's life. I mean, how do you know?
Well, there's a thing called sofek pekuach nefesh. If God forbid a person's home and they can't call anyone and they can't consult, even if there's a doubt. Now, if you're a reasonable person, if you think that your judgment may be completely off, or someone is saying this person's in danger and everyone else says they're not, then I would think that you try to ask a professional as soon as possible. But even if there's a suffix, even if there's a doubt, halachically speaking, even if there's 1% doubt, you do what you have to do, and that's that. And if you made a mistake, you made a mistake. That's the practical answer to your question. But we're talking here, of course, a situation where there can be some reflection and some deliberation. That's what I'm really qualifying. Obviously, a person's literally in an emergency situation. There's no time to wait. It's like the fire is burning. You just do what you have to do, whether you're sure or not sure. So that's the answer to that.
Mm-hmm.
But
Okay.
I would take it a step
But
further.
just for the record, I would just say that not necessarily means because the neshamas, the person who's making the decision is like a beis din, and it's overriding the Torah. It's because the Torah itself says that I was given to preserve life, and therefore, if there's a situation where there's even a small doubt of danger, I'm giving you the right to break the Shabbos or Yom Kippur or whatever it may be, or eat a non-kosher substance because it's the only thing that will save a life. So I don't know if you need to then, even though you could argue Pekuach Nefesh itself is because a neshama is higher than Torah, because to save a life is more important than following a law in the Torah. But that's another discussion. Here he's actually talking about the Koyach HaBeis Din. He's not talking about, he doesn't bring Pekuach Nefesh. I brought it because it's an easy example, but it's not necessarily the only example. Because many of the Torah Shah were not necessarily because of Pekuach Nefesh. Like, for example, the writing down of the written Torah, of the oral Torah, was not Pekuach Nefesh literally saving a life. It was saving the Torah, actually. But, so it's all different circumstances. But it all goes into the general picture of going beyond what it says in the Torah based on the circumstances.
That's what I was about to say also, because since we're all Nishmos Yisrael, we all have that power. And like a circumstance, for example, that comes to mind, if you have a Chabad house and someone's coming and being Machal Shabbos, and really, according to the law of the Torah, you can't, whatever, invite them, or you have to like give them whatever it is, that you make a decision on the spot to Eis Lasas Lashem. Because the ultimate foundational.
I would suggest anyone that has that dilemma, they should ask a Rav beforehand, because situations come up. It's not a decision on the spot. You can always ask a Rav, what do you do If
Right, for the
somebody
big things you do
drive,
ask the Rav, but like sometimes things come up on the spot that you have
yeah,
to
but
like,
that's not because the neshamas have such a power. And I'm making that very clear because that's very dangerous. What happens if a person decides then to take the law in their own hands and they have their own calculations? That's why I said if it's a immediate emergency, then you can't wait. But in many situations, you could consult. And we're not a Bezdin, and you're not a Rav. This is not saying that every person has the ability to be a Rav. Absolutely not. I want to make that very clear. A Rav requires certain credentials. That's why it says the koyach of a Bezdin. However, if it's an immediate emergency, it's immediate emergency. I'm not talking about an emergency of life, saving a life. Most cases that are not an emergency need to be consulted. And listen, and no, we cannot say because we're neshamas are higher than Torah, we can just make decisions no matter what. It's like a bezdin would make decisions. That's where I would make sure that that's a very line I would not cross.
And added to the our betachon should rule us in some situation. We have to see the perspective from inside.
Yeah, look, keep in mind, with all that he's saying here, there's the first half of the story. Torah illuminates us in most cases because we don't have clarity. Why do we look into Shulchan Aruch? Why do we look into the Torah? Because as much as a neshama is a high level, he made it very clear. The neshama comes down below, it doesn't have that clarity. It's like saying, I want to see in the dark. You can't see in the dark. You need to have a light. Torah is that light. So let's not forget that that's the first point of departure. Then he's saying, once we access that, and you're dealing with Talmidei Chachamim and Bezdin, there is an element and situations where they're mashpia and Torah. Well, first of all, the shamas are mashpia and Torah, like Simchas Torah, we're mashpia into Torah. Or like he said here, Mamshech Atzmo Sein Sof into Torah and into mitzvahs. And then he's explaining with this will also explain why you have these fewer situations. These are very rare situations where that Bezdin can go beyond Torah. So let's just put this into the proper context. Torah is still our guide. That's where we turn to. And frankly, even this that we're learning is also coming from Torah. Interestingly, the Torah is even telling us the guidelines when you can go beyond Torah. And because everything comes through Torah ultimately. But it does explain how a Bezdin can make this decision. Because if Torah was fundamentally higher than Neshamas, then how could a Neshama overrule Torah? So you have to say that they can because they have this power. Just let me put this into proper context. Okay, done. So we'll stop here. There's one more piece here with it. We'll do that tomorrow already. I'll just wait. He's going to talk about the Torah Tshuva, fine, and then Eid Hariyah. Good. Anyone else want to ask anything or comment or anything, or we're ready to stop the recording? Okay. So we're stopping before the parentheses on page 1408. Good. Let me just see.